Dr. Johnson is a psychologist and a nurse practitioner in child psychiatry at the U. He's been studying meditation's effects on the brain since the university acquired an MEG machine in the late 90s, and has continued to pursue contemplative research with particular emphasis on cultivating compassion and countering the emergence of psychiatric disorders. And before he comes up, I just want to say that he and I are part of a contemplative committee at the U in which we are working with the faculty for introducing contemplative practice within the classroom to do just as he said, countering the emergence of psychiatric disorders of students at the U. So I'm very happy to welcome Michael Johnson.
Morning. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and see if this is picking up okay. And what I hope to do is first kind of give you an overview of how extraordinary the brain is and how plastic it is. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief introduction to neuroplasticity, and then I'm going to move towards what has been an absolutely explosive field of neuroscientific work in meditation, especially just in the last few years. I remember becoming interested in meditation back in the late 90s when we had some really cool technology to look at the brain, and trying to get meditation practitioners to come in, and people laughing about it and thinking that it was rather ridiculous. Fringe research from the 60s, you know, kind of hippie stuff. What are you doing this for? And then I think nobody anticipated what was going to happen, especially with the Mind Life Institute that Shirley mentioned, and just the extraordinary scope. We've gone from a tiny amount of funding and interest to hundreds of millions of dollars being put into research and meditation now, and it's extraordinary to see it. So if we look at the brain, at about the time that you get born, you have about 87 billion nerve cells in your brain. And those nerve cells, most of them are in, let's see if I can use this pointer here, in this very outer shell of the brain. See how I'm kind of running the pointer along it? And this very outer shell that's only about 3 or 4 millimeters thick is the repository of these neurons, especially the ones that are part of your higher level of functioning. When you become conscious of something, these are the neurons that are activating. We can see the correlate. And in addition, these neurons in this shell are highly interconnected. So each one of them sprouts out a little cable called an axon that's covered with myelin. That's why it's white. And these axons all interconnect within the neocortex. And I always ask people, can you guess how many miles of wiring you have just in your brain? Does anyone want to take a guess? Any rough guesses out there, Gary?
2 million.
Not quite. 110,000 miles worth, which, you know, is still quite an extraordinary amount when you think about it. Most of that wiring just connects within this shell itself. 95% of it connects within the shell itself. Only 5% of it actually goes out to your sensations and makes your body work. Now, I mention that statistic because it actually has profound implications for understanding spiritual states. So I'll come back to that at the end. So if I don't bring it up, I want you to ask me about it at the end, because it's rather remarkable what that means. That all of the input and output in the human brain, 95% of it is contained within its own neocortex. That's unlike animals. Animals don't have that. You know, so it's a remarkable thing. Let's see. So all these billions of neurons firing off like little batteries, sending their signals back and forth, and it's like this ocean of electrical activity now because of this. Extraordinary ocean. And because there's this reciprocation, it's literally like an ocean of electrical activity. There's waves that we can see now with our imaging devices propagating through this outer shell of the brain, waves of electrical activity that correlate to your conscious experience. Now, whoops, I went a little too far here. If we take a little chunk of this neocortex, this 3 or 4 millimeters of neocortex, and we magnify it, and we start looking closer and closer and closer at it, we start to see the nerve cells. You see those little dots. And when we finally get really close, this is what we see. We see these, there's using a staining technique, and there's billions of these neurons here, so we're just staining a few of them so you can see them, because otherwise they'd get lost in the mess. We stain these neurons, and the most important neurons in this shell we call pyramidal neurons, and they look like trees. And these pyramidal neurons are really the workhorse of the brain. They are really what is generating the brain waves that are in your brain. These are remarkable neurons. This is where the substrate of the dance of life is. And these neurons occupy this cortex just like a rainforest. So when you think of the neocortex of the human brain, I want you to think of a rainforest. And at the very outer surface, as you run your fingers across the surface of the brain, you're touching all of these treetops in these pyramidal neurons. And these treetops, each tree has about 10 to 100,000 connection points, or synapses, where the neurons go, where the neurotransmitters work. And so if you multiply this out, can anyone tell me how many synapses we have in our brain? So we've got at least 87 billion nerve cells, but how many connection points are there in these treetops? Does anyone? Trillion's way too small. Well, the answer is, well, before I get to the answer, let me just say, so in these treetops, all of these signals, all these synapses fire off, and depending on the sum total of those patterns, the neuron either fires off or it doesn't. It's sort of binary, like in computers. So we gather the information, the neurons gather the information, and then they either fire off or they don't, and then it propagates to the other neurons. But getting back to my story, or the question, how many do we have at the time of birth? And the answer is rather remarkable. It's 10 to 15 quadrillion. Okay? So I always, when I do lectures, I ask students, well, can you even wrap your head around, no pun intended, 10 or 15 quadrillion synapses? And basically, I had to calculate this physically. It took me a while one time. But I tried to figure out how many grains of sand there were in a cubic foot of sand, and I found some, there's actually papers published on it in physics journals, if you can believe it. But if you take a 2 to 3 foot cubic swath of sand, and you count all the grains of sand in that on both coasts of the United States, you'll eventually get to about 10 to 15 quadrillion grains of sand. It might take you a while, but you'll eventually get there. And what happens next is, so you come out of the womb and you've got 10 or 15 quadrillion synapses, and then by the time you're an adult, they get pruned down to a mere 1 quadrillion. I mean, your brain gets hammered from development on purpose. Mother Nature wants you to be overly prepared for the world, so Mother Nature gives you way more than what you need, which is why children really are truly more conscious than we are. Their brain metabolism is triple what ours is because they have so many dang synapses. They're unspecialized. But unfortunately, they have to get pruned and become adults and all of that. So I figured out that we're awake for about 216,000 hours. So we're processing information, through our senses for 216,000 hours in our lifespan. So that means we have about if you view like all these synapses as gigabytes, that means we have about 4 gigabytes of brain storage per hour. So, even though we're left with just 1 quadrillion, we have plenty to get us through our life and record all of our 3-dimensional memories, smells, tastes, and emotions, and so on and so forth. So, how does this work in neurodevelopment? So we got all these synapses, but what happens? Well, first off, one of the laws of neuroscience and learning is that neurons that fire together wire together. So as you're activating all of these synapses through your touch, your smell, your vision, they're all interacting and reinforcing each other in this complex array of patterns. And that strengthens those synapses. It changes their physical structure so that they fire off more easily. And if certain synapses don't get stimulated of this excessive pool, they die off, they atrophy. And in addition, the ones that we are using, not only do the synapses get stronger, but the cables coming out of those neurons get more insulation on them. They get more myelin, they get thicker, we myelinate them. And when they get more myelin, they can fire off a lot easier. So our learning, our substrate of consciousness, is really about selectively keeping certain constellations of synapses and strengthening the cables in our brain. And that's what learning is. And that's the substrate of our memories. So those treetops literally hold our memories in these complex arrays of synapses. Now, what's going to happen is we got this huge rainforest with these extraordinary treetops, and beginning even in the womb, as we feel and experience things, pruning starts to happen. And what Mother Nature is going to do is open up critical windows of brain regions that need to be pruned. It's kind of like Mother Nature's looking at this whole big mass of synapses and saying, okay, this region I'm going to turn on right now and make it ripe for pruning. And you better take advantage of it, because if you don't, I'm going to cut those synapses. You're not going to get to shape them. So Mother Nature is going to drive potentiality in the brain. And of course, we all know that potentiality is driven most in early childhood. It's also driven by what our own genetics gives us. So if you come from a family of artists, by the time you're 3 or 4, you might actually be drawing quite well, because your pruning has been driven by an innate process that gave you a talent. And then environment will interface with both of those genetic things. So we each have our own little Edward Scissorhands in us. That's our innate family genetics, and that is our universal species genetics, forcing us to prune in a certain way. And then our environment is going to interface with Edward, and we're going to get some sort of shape, or many shapes in there, over the course of our life. And developmental windows are important. It's like in children. If you get a child who's 1 year old and they get fluid in their ears from strep infections and they can't hear well, and nobody picks that up for a few years, they will develop speech and language problems that will follow them the rest of their life. Why? Because the pruning was there, Mother Nature gave you that window, and you missed it, so those neurons got cut before you could populate them. And most of that driven windows of opportunity are in childhood, and our culture and society really focuses on making sure that children can hear right. They don't have lazy eye, because if you don't correct the lazy eye, then your Visual cortex will get pruned wrong. But it extends across the board for functions. Children that are in orphanages, because I treat some of these children, who got no nurturance during 0 to about 2 or 3, even if they're in a loving family, they have problems with emotions and boundaries. Why? Because there's regions of the brain that control our social interactions and our understanding of boundaries and connecting with people. And if those don't get pruned right between 0 and 3, you get a kid that doesn't understand boundaries or socialization for the rest of their life. There was a window of opportunity. Social, emotional circuits need to get pruned at certain times too. And while most of this happens in childhood, while Mother Nature throws huge critical windows up, one of the remarkable things that we've learned from neuroimaging recently is that those driven windows of opportunity are happening in your 30s, they're happening in your 40s, they're happening in your 50s, and they're happening into your 60s. And it's only about when you get into your 60s that Mother Nature leaves you alone and actually lets you retire. And then you just have sort of your own neuroplasticity where nobody's pushing you around. But I mention this because those critical windows in your 30s, 40s, and 50s nobody talks about. They're ignored. They're somewhat talked about in the psychological literature, but that's where contemplation may play a role, and we have to not neglect those windows of opportunity or we're going to get into trouble. And again, this is another point that I'll come back to at the end in discussion, so remind me if I don't come back to it. Now, we can actually watch the human brain unfold over the lifespan and prune. So again, I'm going to use the analogy of the rainforest. We can use satellite imagery to look at the whole Earth and to see what's happening to the rainforests, right? We can see the deforestation. We can use colors to represent that. With modern imaging technology, we can now do that with the human brain. We can look at the whole human brain and using colors determine where it's being pruned. So in this slide, which is remarkable, you get to see someone go from age 5 to adulthood and watch their brain prune into adulthood in 3 seconds. This was done taking serial MRIs of a group of children until they hit age 20, and then averaging the data together. So are you ready? Here we go. See if I can get this to work. Let me turn this off and maybe I can. Let me see if
And purple is the pruning.
I may not be able to activate this, I apologize. Let's see. Shut the laser point. Let's try this. Whoops. There, I got it. There, watch. It's happening. Okay, so red colors, I'm going to start it over. Red and yellow colors mean thickness. Now watch, you're age 5, 6. And now you're an adult and your brain is blue. It's all been pruned. Not totally yet. Like I said, through your 30s, 40s, and 50s, what you just saw is still happening. It's still going on. It doesn't stop. And what's really fascinating is that when we correlate different regions of the brain with psychometric scales or IQ testing, abilities correlate with different regions pruning. Like language ability in this particular project correlated with areas of the left hemisphere that control language getting pruned right when you expected it. We can actually correlate it with psychological functioning. You can see what I just showed you a little more easily because it's all broken up statically, that you really have, you do start out with those 10 quadrillion neurons or synapses and gradually get pruned down as you become specialized. So why is this important? Why is having a sense of this important? Well, first off, Mother Nature creates potentialities of human functioning that require environmental and cultural shaping for limited periods of time. And we must take advantages of these windows. Like I said, as a society and culture, we're really good at taking advantage of these windows in children, especially cognitively. We are. But, again, I'll hopefully come back to this at the end. We don't take advantage of them as much later in life. You know, we put all of our energy into children and not growing older in this culture and society. And the other reason this is important is contemplative practices, whether it's meditation or prayer or other things, modify these neurotemplates of functioning. That's what we're starting to learn, especially in the last 5 years. So, I'm going to switch gears now. I've given you the overview of how your brain works, propels you through development, makes you into what you are. But when we start talking about the science of meditation, the quandary is always, well, you got to define things and really nail it down. You need an operational definition, right? And for decades, when I was first involved in meditation research, people would debate it, and there were papers on it, and people would say there really isn't a good definition of meditation. You know, it's too general. That's why so many of the papers are awful, because what does it mean if somebody's meditating exactly? And what type of meditation? It's a general term. You know, that could be a whole nother lecture unto itself. But in the last few years, the way it's kind of shook out, the way that people are trying to create at least some sort of scheme, some sort of system for meditation, is to sort of put it into categories. And I'm going to do that today just to simplify things, and then show you very briefly what the summary is, what the meta-analyses are for what is happening in the brain with those different types of meditation. Because we now have hundreds of studies to average together to try to get a sense for this. And the first sort of definition is focused meditation. And our definition for that at present is that you focus on something intensively without fail. In focused meditation, most commonly it's your breath. You keep focusing on your breath, but it could be something else. It could be that you focus on a candle. It could be that you focus on an image of Christ and you only focus on that image. It could be focusing on pretty much anything, but the take-home message is that you have to do it in such a way that you don't get distracted internally or externally by anything else. That you develop a kind of laser beam of focus that doesn't waver. Now, the other thing that goes along with it is religious context. So in almost every major world religion, there's codes of ethics and moral practice. And that's not a coincidence, because what they're trying to do is to get you out of your addictions, to get you out of your workaholic life, to have you simplify your life so that you can enhance and really work on just learning how to focus. You got to learn how to focus. So clean up the messes in your life if you're serious about the contemplative practice, because you've got to learn to focus before we're going to get anywhere else. So focusing meditation, we focus on this one thing and we get really, really good at it, and we develop this kind of focusing laser beam. The other type of meditation, or term that we're using now, is open monitoring meditation. And I view open monitoring meditation really as an extension of the first one, which is why most traditional practices start with the first one commonly, where you do two things in open monitoring meditation. You now begin to focus on other things going on in your consciousness. So you were just focusing on your breath. Now you can begin to focus on your sensations. Now you can begin to focus on your emotions. And now you can even turn the focus on your thoughts. And when you get really good, you can turn the focus on what is the nature of self. And when you start turning this laser beam on these different things, you begin to realize that they weren't what you thought they were now that your focus is better. And that, in fact, every little conscious experience you have actually has far more in it and components of it than you ever realized. So the analogy that I use is that of, well, let's say that I show you a video of a bird taking off of the ground flying. And let's say it's a really fast bird. And so I show you the video, it lasts, a couple seconds. And I say, what did you see? And you say, I saw a bird fly. Okay, that's cool. Anything else? No, the bird just, this blurry thing just flew. But if I shoot it, in ultra video, 1,000 frames per second and slow it down and play it for you, what you see is that the bird tensed its feet and put itself up on its toes and then started tensing its back muscles and then moved its eyes forward and started putting its head up in about 5 or 10 milliseconds. And then some other things happened in another 10 or 20 milliseconds. And so then you realize, oh, well, wait a minute. The bird flying really isn't just flying, but this flying is all these other things that I didn't even realize were happening because I didn't slow it down. When you develop this laser beam of attention, you can begin to dissect every aspect of your consciousness in this way. And furthermore, what you do next is you pull the beam back from a narrow focus to a broad focus, and now you're discerning your whole field into its subtleties. You start to see the rate of change of your own thoughts and your own emotions. And when that happens, something extraordinary happens, which is that you're no longer identified with these things. What's unfolding in your consciousness, you're not identified with. As they say, you become an impartial observer of the phenomena that is unfolding. That's open monitoring meditation and how we conceptualize it. If your practice really continues, and you begin to look at the rate of change of the rate of change of the rate of change, and you keep on going in this process, you find a common ground to everything that is happening, including the beginning of the realization that you yourself are a construct that isn't necessarily a separate thing like the bird flying. Go back to that analogy. And when that reaches its pinnacle, there is no separate self and there is no time. And then we say we're in a non-dual state. Or we say that we've reached a mystical state. Because the mystical state is non-conceptual. You cannot put it into words. So we have this form, this category of meditation. Then we have mantra meditation. Transcendental meditation is probably the most common form that people think of with mantra meditation. But it's the reciting of something over and over again. It could be a prayer, and you become intensively focused on it as part of the practice. And it's broad, depending on the cultural tradition that you're in. But many times, especially in Tibetan traditions, you're focusing on a deity, and it's a very, I call it cognitive emotional component to mantra meditation. You might look at a deity of some sort that represents something, and you're wanting to fill your sense of self with that deity so that you begin to manifest those aspects. So in mantra meditation, you have a focusing component. It is a form of focused meditation. But then there's usually also something else, almost, I would say, more practical being associated with it. It could also be in Christian practices that you focus on Christ, and you focus on meditating on that image and what that embodies and means. I mean, it just depends on what your tradition is, but you're using an image or a deity or a being to become part of that practice. There could also be the verbal things that go with that to strengthen it. tightly related to mantra meditation is loving kindness or compassion meditation. And it has a very practical component. You try to send out love and compassion to the world, to the people around you, or to take in their suffering. You do that practice. You might have a saying related to that practice. Or it may be more sophisticated, especially in the Tibetan traditions, where you picture someone suffering and then you do these very complex visualizations where you really embody someone else's suffering. And then you place yourself in the visualization in their place. Or you picture someone you really hate. So there might be a particular political figure that's really pissing you off. And you picture them in your mind and you slowly replace their image with your dad or your mom and make them like your dad or mom so that you don't hate them as much anymore, maybe. And so there's a very practical component to a lot of the mantra meditation, loving kindness meditations. In addition to these sort of categories that have now evolved in the scientific field, and again, this diagram is a whole nother lecture unto itself, but there's stages in your practice of meditation. And my 3-minute summary of stages is that what you're doing is you are deepening your awareness, de-identifying, as I said, with your sort of ego structures, changing your relationship with the experiences that are coming in from the outside as well as from inside. And through this, you begin to have a sense of increased flow. And as you go further, you start to have a sense of unity of all things. And as you go further, pretty soon there's a unity of yourself with all things. And pretty soon there is no self when we get up to the very top of this pyramid, the non-dual pyramid. And we have transcended, or there's many analogies. We've gone from earth to heaven. We have transcended. Much of meditation practice, much of contemplative traditions are about transcendence. But I always caution, what goes up must come down. I have in my clinic schizophrenics who are absolutely transcendent. There's no question that they are in a non-dual state of mind, but they are not functioning well with their families. They're draining them. And so then I have conversations about how can we come back down to earth so that you don't wear everybody out and you can try to understand this in reality. So just as we must transcend in all the major world religions, we must bring that back down. And that's immanence. We bring it back down, that's compassion. And the way it's conceptualized as you've gone up is to say that you have gone from all is one to seeing that the one has the all in it. Does that make sense? That's how we converge these. And so my favorite compassionate person besides the Dalai Lama and Mother Teresa in modern times is Horton the elephant, because he represents the coming back down to earth, because here's this worthless clover that nobody understands, that people don't understand why he values it, and he sees within that one little clover an entire world, an entire set of beings that are valuable. And he's ridiculed for it. They want to destroy him because of it. It's insane that he would value something like this. But that's really the coming back down. Mother Teresa in her writings represented that probably the most. That you see the beggar out on the street, and how can you not see him as Christ, and is that not beautiful, is what she would say. The divine is in this. And I was thinking of Horton actually when I was in San Francisco recently, And I was seeing how people step over all the homeless people and treat them as complete objects, and how much we've lost the message of Horton in a lot of areas of our culture and society now. So let me just give you one other analogy too, which is that if you think of this diagram here, the transcendence piece, I've also always loved the analogy of the ocean, that we're floating in this ocean, we're floating on the surface of it, we're in the waves, we're fighting the waves, we're fighting the currents, we're identified with the waves and currents, but to the extent that we take up scuba diving or meditation and begin to sink below those waves, which are still there, we didn't get rid of them, is the extent to which we're not identified with them, and we can look up calmly and see what's going on and not be torn apart by them. And as we sink deeper and deeper down, we come to a deeper and deeper calm. As we get deeper into the ocean, things get calmer, and we have an even more objective view of this matrix of electrical activity, this matrix of experience. And not only that, but we figure out that there's not just waves up there, but there's some subtle currents down here that are pulling us in different directions. And so I think that the progression in meditation is very much analogous to this. And not just as an experience, but even in the brain. When we look at brain waves, I see huge analogies as we record these different states and different advanced practitioners. I can see how these things, these electrical changes, these electrical waves, have a really nice analogy to this, which is, to me, is always remarkable from the neuroscientific standpoint. I look at it as beauty when I'm looking at these brain waves and how they've been changed or are changing in front of me with some of these very extraordinarily advanced meditation practitioners. So that brings me to the neuroscience. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, it looks like there's zero imaging that's done. But in fact, there's 2 or 3 studies that were done back then using EEG. It's just that they didn't show up on my diagram. And then it kind of stays low. It's kind of a fringe science thing. A lot of transcendental meditation people had a lot of money, so they paid for their own studies. And so we float along. And then imaging gets better, and then the Mind Life Institute starts coming, and then people start saying, well, geez, maybe we should take this seriously. And then the last decade, just exponential growth. Hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on contemplative research. Every major university now has some sort of meditation or contemplative research going on. It's big business at Harvard. No one cared about it back in the 90s very much. It was almost embarrassing to do it. Now everybody wants to do it. How do we measure the brain? How do we look at meditation? Well, there's PET scanners and there's SPECT scanners, but the 2 biggies have been EEG, which is the oldest method, and MRI, which is the other method. So let me just very briefly talk about those. This is from Richard Davidson's study, I think in 2003, what was on the cover of National Geographic. EEG, you hook electrodes onto the surface of the scalp, and you can pick up the brain waves. The brain waves have different names. There's alpha rhythms, there's delta rhythms, there's theta rhythms, there's gamma rhythms. Again, it's a whole nother lecture for me to tell you what that means, so I'm not going to get into detail. But because of these high density arrays, we can now take what used to be just squiggly tracings on paper that were very crude and basic, and we can map those waves, just like the ocean, unfolding during different states of consciousness onto the surface of the brain. And we can understand what almost any kind of conscious experience you are having is doing to these brain waves. And we can likewise have you do different forms of meditation, and we can see how these brain waves are changing. The other thing we can do is we can put you in an MRI machine, and of course MRI machines are great at taking pictures of the brain. You can also tune them to blood flow in the brain and use them to see which areas of the brain are being activated. So MRI is a cool technology, but anybody who's had an MRI knows it's very noisy and artificial. You know, when I had advanced Zen meditators come in to do functional MRI during non-dual meditation, they said, this is really weird. You know, I can't sit in posture, I'm supposed to lay on my back and this thing's making noise. Sure, I can do some of this, but it's a little different than, you know, what you're thinking when I can sit on the cushion. So we also kind of sometimes wreck things as scientists by, you know, trying to isolate artificially something that we want to know the brain correlate of. Nevertheless, with all these hundreds of studies, and again, this could be a whole nother lecture, but I'm just going to give you some pictures from a meta-analysis recently and very briefly give you the gestalt of it without going into all the details of all the brain regions that are changed, that we can average now these data sets together and we can see that there are consistent, permanent patterns of change in the brain, that parts of the brain are being strengthened, and in all cases, the brain waves are changing, both during meditation and permanently as a state of being that follows you when you've done a lot of meditation. Focused meditation, as I told you before, without question, it's increasing or strengthening the areas of the brain that we use for focusing. Not very surprising. It also strengthens an area of the brain called the insula that I'll come back to towards the end. And open monitoring meditation also has some of the same components as focusing meditation that have been strengthened, but it has additional ones. It has additional areas of the brain that get stronger that allow you to hold the context of information in your mind, and its activations in the insula are especially strong. And the insula is an area of our brain that does many things, but what it does more than anything else is give you an internal sense of an awareness of your whole body. Non-dual meditation has hardly been studied. We tried to do fMRI on Zen Roshis in the 90s with it, and their patterns were all different, so we couldn't publish. But there have been some EEG studies recently that have shown high-frequency activity in the area of the brain that controls your representation of self. So something has happened in their representation of self, and there's a brain correlate of it. What we'd sort of expect. Mantra meditation, we also see the focusing areas of the brain get developed, but in addition, we see the verbal areas of the brain get activated because you're reciting things. There's some logic involved there. And when those meditations, those mantra-type meditations or things similar, involve the conscious, cognitive, emotional practice of developing empathy and wanting to relieve you of your suffering, when we do that, we see the pro-social areas of the brain begin to develop. We see the areas of the brain that control theory of mind ability, and the areas of the brain that are responsible for empathy, namely the insula, more than any other region of the brain, gets very strong. And people who do these meditations are automatically very empathetic, automatically activate more when they see people suffering. So, that is a quick and dirty, just in a nutshell, what I could do 5 lectures on this. Without question, meditation it's strengthening these areas of the brain. It's changing the way that the brain is working. And so, what is this relationship to well-being? Well, it's sort of obvious, right? First off, what we've known for 40 or 50 years is that if you start meditating, you start to relax. If you just sit down and focus on something, you're going to relax. Your heart rate's going to go down, your blood pressure's going to go down, your cortisol is going to go down, and if you have an autoimmune disorder like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, or MS, all those things get improved by just simply sitting and activating your parasympathetic nervous system. We've known that for years. So just by getting a relaxation response and without necessarily going to a monastery or training under somebody, you can get a lot of positive effects from meditation. But if you do take up a repeat practice several times per week, and you do develop really good focused awareness, then that carries over in your day-to-day life where you remain focused without the effort. And you automatically notice things that you would not have noticed before. You're walking out to your car, you notice there's a subtle decrease in pressure on your tire. There's something wrong with my tire, I better get it fixed. But if you hadn't had that focus, you might have driven to your meeting or your work and gotten stranded on the freeway with a flat tire. Or you might walk through the door, your spouse is there, you say hello. But if you're focused, you might notice subtle tension in the facial muscles that it's been a bad day, and then you might respond, did you have a bad day? So you become naturally more empathetic because you're aware and you're not a brainless automaton burned out from your life and your work and so forth. So by developing the focused awareness, it carries through to all aspects of your life. But the most important awareness is the internal awareness that especially comes from the open monitoring. Because as you internally begin to understand the unfolding, the origins of thoughts, the origins of emotion, and the origin of the origin, again going back to my analogy of the bird, you de-identify from these processes, you sink below the waves, and now you have incredible power to do something about those events. You're not in the chokehold of them. Now, I mention this because I'm in psychiatry. I do therapy with children. And this isn't just an issue that is about meditation, but almost all of therapy is, increased awareness. You get somebody that is sort of ADHD, they're hardwired to be ADHD, they're angry all the time, they're impulsive. Somebody pulls in front of them in traffic, they start flipping them off and yelling swear words, and they pull them off to the side of the road and they get into a fist fight. They've been in 4 fist fights. And so now the issue is, why does this happen? Well, the guy made me angry, he's a jerk, and so I beat him up. I flipped him off. Okay, but let's back up. What led to that mass action effect? What was the precursor of it? What was the precursor? Well, the guy pulled me over. That was rude. Yeah, but what was the very thing that was bubbling up? Well, I felt a tension in my back. I started to feel tense. And then a memory came up of my abusive father, who used to do mean things to me. Oh, okay, now we're getting somewhere. You see, we're getting to the origin now. We're getting to the rate of change. And to the extent that you get somebody to the earlier part of their conscious experience, before the mass action, then they can make a true objective decision that I'm not going to flip the guy off, I'm going to relax myself, I'm going to let it go. We can do that with traumatic memories too. We're doing that at the VA right now. We're creating not only therapies that do that, but we're using meditation to bring about an awareness of the worst thing that you don't want to be aware of. Because there's components to that mass action of the trigger of the horrible trauma that I lived through. And if we can get to the subcomponents, then it loses its chokehold, you see. It becomes something different. You've changed the relationship. So you can do this with anything. You can change, if you're a parent and your child is annoying you, you can start to, okay, what is this about? What is going on? And you can start to look at the steps. So the profound internal awareness and seeing the evolution of anything in your mind before it becomes mass action gives you more freedom. You may not get rid of some of the horrible things. You may not get rid of the fact that you're an anxiety-prone person, that everybody in your family has panic attacks for 4 generations, or that You come from high energy people who are always angry and getting into fist fights, but maybe we're great businessmen but are kind of cold and callous. You can begin to have awareness of that aspect, and you might still have those traits, but it doesn't have to rule your life, you see. So this middle one here, that's the most important one. It dovetails into psychiatry to a very large degree. And then finally, it's what I said with Horton the elephant, that the real goal in the end is to integrate your transcendence with immanence, to be in tune with people and to be responsive to the people and to the world around you. And that's really the ultimate goal, if you look at it, of any religious practice, is that you come to this, they call it a bipolar model of contemplative development, where you bring heaven and earth together, or however you wish to conceptualize it, and that's what your life then becomes about, is both of those things.
Meditation, most simply, is the intention to pay attention. And we all have this experience, but maybe it's not something that we spend a lot of time on. So in a way, meditation is an invitation to pay attention. And we have all these levels of paying attention in our lives. And meditation, then, is that one place where we're going to pay the ultimate attention. We're going to bring all of our attention, awareness, and sensory perceptions to just this present moment. It's like stopping in the spring to smell the first lilac, or to listen to the meadowlark as it flows across the prairie. So when we have these moments of sensory awareness and being present, we may ask ourselves, what matters? What matters in our lives? And so in meditation, this question can settle within us and take its place in our heart. And we open our hearts in meditation to see what is within. The words of Ralph Waldo Emerson: what lies before us, what lies behind us, are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. So join me, please, and take a posture that's comfortable, and so that you feel balanced. And have a sense of coming into stillness, collecting your attention from all the distracting thoughts and sensations you may be having as you close your eyes. And opening in the most simple way by breathing together. Follow your breath. Notice where it is in your body that you feel this breath. Is it the belly, your chest, your nose? Bring your awareness to this breath in your body. And now, with the intention to breathe in very deeply, take a breath in slowly and breathe in. And at the end of the inhalation, slowly exhale and release and let go when you exhale your breath. Again, breathe in slowly. Feel the air coming in, expanding your lungs, and then very briefly hold before you exhale, and feel that sense of letting go, a release, and relax. One more time, breathing in, following expanding, and briefly holding. And now softly and gently let go. Let go. Let go. Rest and pause. And observe the breath as it finds its own rhythm. Don't change anything. Just notice the breath breathing you. Noticing the in-breath, notice the out-breath, and notice a sense of resting. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. Fully present in this moment of our life. The breathing in and the breathing out, breath after breath, a full awareness of living. Noticing if there's any place in your body where there may be some holding. In your forehead. Bring an air of softness to your forehead, to your eyes, your cheeks. And putting the lips in a small smile, you'll be able to release all those muscles in the face. Softening. Notice if there's any holding in the shoulders. Gently raise your shoulders, move them back. Feel the weight of your body on the chair. It's helpful to release the obvious places of tension or holding that you might sense. Bring that smile into the heart area. And a feeling of space and openness so that we can loosen and untangle. Just as a glass can be filled with water, the whole body can be filled with awareness and aliveness. Open attention to the body as a field of aliveness and sensation all at once. Not opposing, not controlling anything. Just interested, open attention. And become aware of this experience, of our senses and of our thoughts, sounds around us. All appearing and disappearing. Find the spaces between the sounds, listening to the silence. Stabilize your presence, just resting with the breath. To know you are here, listening to sounds, feeling sensations throughout the body. Whatever helps you to be right here, coming home again and again to this awareness of being present. You can begin fresh in every moment, no matter where the mind has gone, and choose to rest, to relax with the changing flow of experience, moment from moment to moment. And slowly bring your awareness back into the room. Every 2 years, it still isn't warm. Every 2 years. The Dalai Lama meets with scientists from all over the world to discuss the current research in neuroscience. And he started this in the 60s, and since then it has grown considerably. As an outcome of those sessions that he has had with these scientists, he's come to this conclusion. He says, if scientific analysis were conclusively to demonstrate certain claims in Buddhism to be false, like meditation, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon these claims. So this role of neuroscience is extremely important to those of us who meditate. We're a curious bunch, and we want to see what happens when we meditate. And so when I first saw brain imaging and saw Matthew Ricard, you maybe remember the monk with all of the electrodes attached to his head, it was astonishing, and I still think it's astonishing. But today, we've had this brief meditation together, and we've had this meditation experience. Now, Dr. Johnson is going to show us images of the brain that are affected by meditation.